So we're starting the webinar on the history of New York City museums, and my name is Beth Levinthal. I'm the current executive director of the Hofstra University Museum, and I am a native Long Islander. My commitment to the arts is steadfast and strong, especially to arts education. In 2006, I started here at Hofstra. I can't believe I've been here for almost a decade already, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. But prior to coming to Hofstra, I was executive director also at the Hofstra Museum of Art in Huntington for a number of years. And both of these museums are accredited by the American Alliance of Museums, and that is an honor and distinction shared by only 3% of our nation's museums, so we wear it proudly. And through my career, I have facilitated and created a number of arts education programs for learners across the lifespan and original exhibitions. And so I was very honored to discover last April that the Museum Association of New York was honoring me with their Ann Ackerson Innovation in Museum Leadership Award. So that's sort of where I come from. And today we're going to begin with a conversation about museums. And I think the best place to start is with this quote from Philippe de Montebello, who stated that museum is the memory of mankind. I would take it further to say that museums aren't only our memory, but they are places that engage us in the present. By looking at objects from our past and as well as contemporary objects, we engage in dialogue. We talk about issues that connect us with our past, but they also connect us with ideas that might formulate best practices for our future. Where do museums begin? Well, they have a long history in human life. They started actually with the word museum, coined by the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, when they built their first temple to the Muses. These were sprightly goddesses that watched over actually the arts and sciences. And the Greeks filled their temples with scholars and with sculpture, actually. We're going to move forward very rapidly to the royal treasure houses of Europe that were really embedded and representing some of the treasures of war that were remarkable in the royal palaces and also in the royal zoos. And then we come to the early American collectors who were motivated with a rather different perspective and a different impulse than the kings of Europe. In fact, according to the historian Stephen Asma, in the United States we had, as we all know, we had a new continent that was being explored, and it was open to discoveries of remarkable new natural objects that had never been seen before, and the realization that these objects, even shells and different types of flora and fauna, animals, were the desire to share this information more globally. And so the earliest museums were, for lack of a better phrase, they were sort of houses of the bizarre. They were very eclectic they were what we call now houses or cabinets of curiosities that had no specific agenda for collecting, but they wanted to collect everything. Here we see in this brief history of museums, this is actually the very first museum in the United States, before we were even the United States, was started in 1773, and it was the Charleston Museum. We're seeing a slide right now from a contemporary exhibit that they are housing. So this is the longest standing museum in the United States. And in their first displays, again, it was this cabinet of curiosities with indigenous rattlesnakes that were collected and shells that were unique to our shores and pottery shards. But in the contemporary world, they still have that sense of a little bit of everything, which is a very interesting place to be in our contemporary world. In 1786, the famed artist Charles Wilson Peale created his own cabinet of curiosities and opened a museum in Philadelphia. And in the museum, it was originally to house his own portrait work of major statesmen of the day, but he also was a great collector. And so eventually, in doing explorations throughout North America, there even was a woolly mammoth that was included in this, again, bizarre sort of cabinet of curiosities. This takes us now to the beginning of our story and today's real focus, which is the rise of museums and the history of museums in New York City. So where do we begin? Actually, prior to 1800, the only museum that's recorded in the history of New York City was on the island of Manhattan, was actually created by the Tammany Society. And these were a fraternity of patriots that were solemnly consecrated to independence, to popular liberty, and also to creating a federal union and a new country. The Tammany Society was actually established in 1787, so we already were a brand new nation. And under the leadership of their first president, or what they called their first sagamore, John Pintard, they were defining their purpose for a museum also as collecting and preserving everything relating to the history and the union of our country that pertain to the arts and to natural life. A detailed list of early gifts that came to the museum were wampum beads, tomahawks, belts, there were earthen jars, and along with antiquities. And the doors to the Tammany Museum actually opened on May 21st, 1791. And it was located not in the building we're seeing here, but it was actually on City Hall at Wall Street. But by 1794, in fact, the founders of the museum and the Tammany Society really wanted a very major presence for the museum. And so they constructed this building that we see that was located near Broad Street. The bottom level was actually an open market during the weekdays, and the top level, the second floor, was a very beautiful museum, as well as a place where they would hold meetings of the Tammany Society. The doors opened in 1794. And by 1795, the Tammany Society had actually kind of waned in their interest for maintaining a museum. And so they sold their interest in the museum to a gentleman named Gardner Baker. And he was a very enthusiastic caretaker of the museum and added significantly to the collection, in fact, even including a full-length portrait of General George Washington by the famed artist Gilbert Stuart in the collection. But unfortunately, Gardner died rather shortly after taking ownership. He contracted yellow fever. And so the museum began to have a series of owners over time. And eventually, actually, it was in the 1840s that none other than Phineas T. Barnum purchased the Tammany Museum. And he had just come back from a major tour of Europe, had made a tremendous splash and a fortune. And so he was on a buying spree. And not only did he purchase this museum, but he also ended up purchasing Charles Willson Peale's museum in Philadelphia. And by the 1860s, Barnum's Museum of Wonders, as he renamed the Tammany Museum in New York City, had about 400,000 visitors a year, which is remarkable for the day. So this is where we start to shift from these cabinets of curiosities, these sort of cornucopia of objects that are being collected and shared through the museums, to a much more focused way of looking at museums. And we come to the Museum of the New York Historical Society, which was founded in November of 1804. And again, it was largely due to the efforts of none other than John Pintard, who had been that first president or sagamore of the Tammany Society. He served actually at the time as the secretary of the Academy, the American Academy of Fine Arts. And this was a thriving institution in this period. And he was also the founder of the first savings bank in New York City, and he also was a very early proponent of public education for a free school system. At the first organizational meeting for the Historical Society, there were 11 of the city's most prominent citizens were in attendance, including Mayor DeWitt Clinton, who became actually one of the co-founders of the New York Historical Society. And Pintard was advocating at that time, as he had been in the past, for a museum that would collect and preserve whatever would relate to the natural, civil, and ecclesiastical history of the United States, with particular interest in what was going on in the state of New York. By invitation of the American Academy of Fine Arts, in 1809, the New York Historical Society found its first home in a government building, and it was their home downtown until 1816, when they were able to begin to develop their own means to build and construct a museum, where they hoped to actually build in Central Park. Central Park was really the area that many, many New Yorkers were moving to at that period of time, and it was a hub of activity. So there was a 5-member executive committee of the New York Historical Society at the time, and they created a proclamation, basically, that they were going to construct in the southeast corner of Central Park a museum devoted to antiquities, science, and art. In fact, they lobbied New York State legislature for this to occur, and in April of 1868, in fact, the legislature did pass an act stating that there would be, for the society, a park constructed between 81st and 84th Streets, 300 feet west of Fifth Avenue, and that this would be the building that actually we see to this day. So the construction of the 8th and current home began in 1902. The doors opened in 1908, and by 1938, the whole central block area included extensions to the core pavilion, and that's the museum that we know to this day. And by 1966, this structure was placed on the given landmark status by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. And here we see an early work that was added into the collection by the famed American artist John Durand, and just showing you a couple of images. This, of course, is a very iconic image that we know by Childe Hassam, flags on 57th Street from 1918, very patriotic, as we were in World War I at that time, and just coming at the end of World War I and celebrating the victory, actually. So where do we go from here? Well, the National Academy of Design, at the beginning of the 19th century, actually, there were quite a number of important museums in the city of New York. There were 6 actually important museums and institutions, and half of those no longer exist. But again, there were leaders of the community that felt that they wanted to create an academy of design that was similar, in fact, to the model that was used in Europe, particularly in Britain and their British Academy of Design. However, in the first meeting, which took place in 1825 to begin discussing an academy, it was attended by a group of artists and architects, including Thomas Cole and Rembrandt Peale, the scientist, inventor, and artist Samuel F.B. Morris of the Telegraph, and Asher B. Durand, as well as the artist Henry Inman. And while they wanted a Royal Academy such as they had in London, excuse me, they did also want a place that was more egalitarian. They didn't want, as they did in London, to have an organization that was financed by the state. They wanted it to have its own source of financing. And also they wanted as their mission to promote the arts in America through instruction and exhibition. And for the very first time in our country, in fact, the formation of the National Academy of Design created an institution for us that was conceived by artists and architects and for artists and architects at its core. And so they believed that through the practice of teaching and exhibition, the fine arts would flourish and that we would be promoting the arts in a non-patronage system. And the Academy actually to this day continues very much in with the framework that first defined it all those years back. So here we see the 1860 home of the National Academy, and here are some of the early works that were included by William Tross Richards. This is a beautiful watercolor on paper of Fidelia's Bridge's garden in Cannon, Connecticut. And also, we come to the contemporary. This is an active collecting institution. Roberto Juarez, this is Whale from 2008, and he gifted this work to the National Academy in 2013. Today, the Academy includes over 300 artists and architects with over 2,000 having been elected. It's an election process. You have to be nominated. It's a very rigorous process to be accepted and to be a participant, to keep the standards at the highest level. But through the years, there have been 2,000 artists and architects who've been accepted into the Academy. And because of that, each artist or architect actually donates a work of art, at least one. So the collection now includes more than 7,000 works. And it's a remarkable place to visit for contemporary work as well as works from the past. And now we come to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. By the end of the Civil War, people of culture in our nation really were united in their desire for the creation of what they called a permanent gallery or museum in New York that reflected the international stature of the United States. There were renewed efforts in 1870 to carry out a plan to build a New York historical home in Central Park, and for it to continue to be that repository of history, antiquities, and art within Central Park. But we all know that never happened. And simultaneously with that renewed effort was, in the same year, an effort to create the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And in fact, the museum incorporated in 1871, and in 1871, the New York State Legislature actually passed a budgetary piece to give $500,000 for the erection of a building within Central Park for a museum, or close to Central Park on some public land that would be a museum belonging to the city of New York. At this point, between the fledgling Met and the longer standing museum, the New York Historical Society, they had amassed collections that many felt were equivalent, if not surpassing, the caliber of works and art that were contained at that time in the British Museum. And the reports indicate that the Historical Society was seen as the art museum that represented masterpieces and products from every age and from every school. And a grand focus at the time was really on the art of the continent of Europe. and they attract the geniuses of the day and the geniuses of the past and the talent and the art from the remotest regions, and they were transcending our own national interests to irradiate, they said, and refine and inspire a collection for the ages and across all influences. So in order to foster an interest in really pushing forward the development of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Art Committee of the Union League of New York City at the time of that club sent invitations out to a wide swath of organizations and to the members of the National Academy of Design, to the New York Historical Society members, to members of the Century Club, the Manhattan Club, and numerous other very interested parties in the city of New York to come together with the concept of creating and erecting a museum that would represent these grand interests of our nation and of the world. There were more than 300 members present in that first meeting from all these different organizations, and there were artists and editors, there were attorneys, there were merchants, there were architects, and Frederick Church, Albert Bierstadt, John Kensett, Charles Gifford, William Hart, and Kenneth Miller Hayes, all really highly regarded artists of the day, were all in attendance at that first meeting. And they really were pushing for very strongly for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But it was actually William Cullen Bryant who was selected as the speaker and the presiding officer of the group, because everyone felt that he was affiliated with all of the art movements, but he himself wasn't an artist, and so he could speak without influence. And he could represent the voices of the majority of individuals and be sort of magnanimous in his approach to the development of such. And this is what he said partially in that first evening. We are assembled, my friends, to consider the subject of founding in this city of New York a repository of the productions of artists of every class, which shall be in some measure worthy of the greatest metropolis and the wide empire of which New York is the commercial center. I understand that no rivalry with any other project is contemplated, no competition, save with the similar institutions of other countries, to have a place, they felt, that was equal to some of the grand museums and collections of Europe. And certainly, as we know, they were quite successful. Here's an image of the Met as it was constructed at its current site, 1005th Avenue, in 1914, a grand, grand structure. And I thought it would be interesting to see just inside the Met, this is a scene from 1913 capturing a tour, a lecture being given by a docent named Miss Abbott, who is lecturing to visitors to the gallery. And you can see the skylight, which is quite beautiful in this gallery, and some of the works. And here we see just a couple of the major objects out of the 1 million+ objects that reside in the collection of the Met. Vincent van Gogh's self-portrait with a straw hat from 1887, Rembrandt, a self-portrait from 1660. Quite the most remarkable museum, most likely in our world today. And I thought it would be interesting to, in our conversation about the Met, to talk about its newly unveiled logo, the Met, which came out just a couple of weeks ago to great controversy. Anytime we have change for an iconic institution graphically, it's very difficult for us to contemplate the shift to a different look, a different Met. But as we know, the Met of today now encompasses 3 institutions. It is its prime location of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's the cloisters up in Fort Tryon in the Washington Heights area, and under renovation is the Met Breuer, which is the former home of the Whitney Museum of American Art that they'll be opening shortly, and to bring all of the past and the tradition together with the contemporary, this new logo and design has been unveiled, along with a number of major interesting digital connections that are being made by the Met every day. So in that same period of time that the Met and others were contemplating museums for the arts and architecture, we had individuals that were also very interested in our natural history. The Arsenal Building in Central Park was the first home to the American Museum of Natural History, and the founders of that museum included Theodore Roosevelt Sr., who was the father of Theodore Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and J.P. Morgan, Charles Dana, as well as Joseph Choate of Choate School, and Robert Colgate of Colgate University at this point. They were the leaders of commerce and influence in that time. And the founding of the museum was really the realization of a very long-held dream by the naturalist Dr. Albert S. Bickmore, who had been a student at Harvard of the very famed zoologist Louis Agassiz. And Bickmore had for years lobbied for the establishment in our nation of a museum that would be devoted to the natural history of New York, which is very interesting. And his backing by these men of influence was instrumental in gaining the support at the time of the then governor of New York State, a man named John Thompson Hoffman, who signed a bill resolving to create the American Museum of Natural History on April 6, 1869. So we have all this activity taking place 1868, 69, 70, 71 to construct these remarkable museums for not only our city but also for our nation, all in New York. The original Victorian Gothic building actually opened its doors in 1877, and we're looking at what is still the main entrance on Central Park West. And in that entrance, for those who visited, you know that there is a memorial to Theodore Roosevelt, and it was completed by the artist John Russell Pope in 1936. So here we have this hub of activity taking place that takes us really into the latter part of the 19th century. And then we start to have a whole other dynamic that begins to occur in the city of New York. Certainly Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who was born on January 9th, 1875, has a great influence and a role to play as she grows up. She was born the eldest daughter of the eldest son of the richest American family. And Gertrude wrote her own autobiography, My History, in which she said, "One of the first things I remember was how much I longed to be a boy. I was 4 years old when I couldn't resist temptation any longer, and I stole into my mother's room and I cut off my curls." You know, many doors were closed to women of that era, and particularly a young woman from a very wealthy family had a very rigidly structured life. And Gertrude Vanderbilt was anything if she was definitely not a rigid individual. She was a free spirit. She was an artist. But she did live a life that really gave her a very strict guidelines for most of her early years. She married Harry Whitney in August of 1896 at the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island. And already by 1904, she was considering how she could become a patron of the arts. What would be the best way that she could promote the arts in our nation, while she herself actually was a trained sculptor. And in fact, in 1914, she decided to open her own studio for her own work at 19 McDougal Alley in New York City. It was a two-story structure, and on the first floor, she actually devoted space to American artists so that they would have a place to show. Because for all of these museums that we've spoken about, there was no place for the average artist, the working artist, to actually show their work. New York at that time was completely obsessed with European art in 1914 because just the year before, there was the famous Armory show in New York City that had introduced American audiences to European modernist art. And Gertrude felt strongly there needed to be a counterpoint. There needed to be a place for American artists, and especially New York artists, to show their work. So at the same time that she was doing this, she got her very first major sculptural commission, which is the Titanic Memorial. It's a granite monument that still stands in a Washington, D.C. park near the Potomac River. And from that point on, she received numerous national and international commissions. While she was acting as a sculptor and a supporter of the arts, she was amassing a significant collection herself. And in 1929, she offered 500 of her works to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to add to their collection. And they rejected her request. But she would not be daunted. And so she decided in 1930 to create her own Museum of American Art. And this is what she said at the time. Not only can the visiting foreigner find no adequate representation and growth and development of fine arts in America under a single roof, the same difficulty faces the native who wants to learn more about American art and what it's all about. And so the primary purpose for the Whitney Museum of American Art was to discover fresh talents and to stimulate the creative spirit of the artist before the artist was deadened by old age. It will not be a repository of American artists and what they've done in the past, but it will be of the contemporary artist. And ever since museums have been invented, contemporary liberal artists have found difficulty, she said, in, quote, crashing the gate. Museums have had the habit of waiting until the painter or sculptor has acquired a certain official recognition before they would accept their work and into what she considered their sacred portals. And by contrast, the Whitney was going to be a place where it would be a place that would not only be for the artist of a contemporary society, it would also be staffed by artists, and the board would include artists as well. And so the Whitney was founded. Here we see the Whitney as it existed from 1966 until 2014 at its home on Madison and 75th Street. And throughout its history, no institution in New York has actually been as passionate about the work of contemporary artists and communicating that through the work that it's done than the Whitney. And it's been both daring and simultaneously at times conservative in the exhibits that it mounts. It's an interesting dichotomy of an institution. Here's an early work that was in the collection by Theodore Robinson, American artist, Etude from 1890. George Bellows was in her very early collection, 1924, Dempsey and Firpo, oil on canvas. We see the Oscar Blumner Old Canal Port from 1914. And here we see the newly unveiled and open Whitney as it exists today at 99 Gavins Street in Lower Manhattan. And this is a view that was taken from the High Line. And what a transformed institution it truly has become. And it still speaks to that same motivation as it had for all of the years of its existence, thanks to Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. The Whitney of today houses approximately 18,000 works of art by American artists, and in 1991 they started a very aggressive photography collection, and the names in that collection of the luminaries in the American art world are just extraordinary, from Joseph Albers and Thomas Hart Benton to Willem de Kooning and Robert Rauschenberg, Andy Warhol, you name it. It's a veritable who's who of artists that are in that remarkable and growing collection. The Museum of Modern Art was founded in the same year that Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney created her own museum. And this was championed in 1929 by Abby Rockefeller, much to the distress of her husband, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who wanted his wife to be more involved with her home life. But she promised him that once this was constructed, she would, in fact, devote more time to their home life. The first home of MoMA was at the corner of 5th and 57th Street, which actually was on the 12th floor of the August Heckscher building, the same August Heckscher of Heckscher Museum of Art in Huntington. And their first director was a gentleman named Alfred Barr, who was very instrumental in transforming the MoMA from its early collection of literally 8 works of drawing and 1 painting to the iconic institution that it would become. It was conceived as a museum exclusively devoted to European modernism. And they've been rather faithful to that vision, actually. The first show in November of 1929, which was opened just 9 days actually after the collapse on Wall Street, included works by Vincent van Gogh, Paul Gauguin, Paul Cézanne, and Georges Seurat. Within 10 years, they had outgrown their space. And so they turned to Rockefeller and asked him if he would give them funding to erect a new museum. And fortunately, he did. In 1939, Nelson Rockefeller, who was all of 30 years old, was voted in as the president of the board. And they brought in architects to create the first international-style museum building in our nation. And by 1948, Nelson had stepped out, and his brother David Rockefeller took over as the president of the board. We know that MoMA has gone through many iterations over the years, with a 1997 redesign by the Japanese architect Yosui Tangetsushi, which has been to this day a rather controversial redesign. People feel it's closed off spaces, it doesn't flow as well. And so in 2014, they announced a new renovation that's about to take place and will be completed in 2018-19, where spaces will be reopened up to the public. There'll be a public for free sculpture garden, and the flow will be much more to people's liking. Here are some, again, of the early works of Vincent van Gogh, The Starry Night, 1889, Henri Matisse, The Dancers. We have De Chirico and Henri Rousseau. And of course, the collection is just magnificent, and their work continues to be stellar throughout all these years. And our final stop will be the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. And Guggenheim was, again, he was actually born in Philadelphia in 1861 to a very wealthy mining family, and he himself founded the Yukon Gold Company in Alaska. Among other business interests, he was a very, very wealthy man. He began collecting European masterworks in the 1890s, and he was very interested in growing a collection that would be very prestigious and of interest to American audiences. He connected with the artist Baroness Hilla von Riebe in 1926, and she actually helped guide his taste in collecting for the remainder of his life. And by 1939, he and Riebe felt that they had amassed enough of a collection to open his own museum of non-objective art on 24 East 54th Street. But again, their collecting and their work was growing at such a pace that by the 1943, he felt he needed to build a new structure, and he hired Frank Lloyd Wright. The Guggenheim that we know today was the only building designed in New York City by Wright. And he saw it as his opportunity to construct something that would really break up the landscape of that area on Fifth Avenue in New York. And he certainly did. It was a very controversial design. It rises 3/4 of a mile high in the spiraling construction of concrete with a domed ceiling. And his concept was so unique that he thought it needed a new name, right? And he was, at a time, was lobbying for it to be called an arcasium rather than a museum. But as we know, it does stand today as the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, and here's a look down. You can only go one way, or up. You can go up the spiral, or you can go down. And it's been a challenge for curators through the years, continuing to this day. But the work they do is remarkably groundbreaking, and it's become such an iconic structure. It's now influenced architects for many, many years. Guggenheim died 10 years actually before the museum opened, and Frank Lloyd Wright actually died 6 months before the opening. So it really lasts as one of his last iconic structures in his remarkable career. So I do hope you've enjoyed this brief overview. Today, more than 100 museums dot the landscape of the island of Manhattan, and certainly it's going to be fascinating for all of us to watch as we look, and here are some of the works you're going to see in the Guggenheim collection, as we look to the future and how museums will continue to evolve as we move forward into the 21st century. And so now I would open it up to any questions that you all may have, and thank you very much for listening. North Woodmere, do you have any?
It's not a question, it's a statement here.
Yes.
The program was terrific, but there are so many more museums in Manhattan that are unbelievable. The Rubin, there's a Chinese museum, there's a Jewish museum, there's every kind of museum. We could have another whole session.
We could have about 100 more. I agree with you. It's the most remarkable city for museums. It's really the cultural leader, I believe, of the world in terms of the museums that exist. And there's even the Museum of Sex. I mean, there's something for everyone in New York City at this point. But it started way back, and it's just a remarkable tradition. But I 100% agree with your comment. It is a cornucopia of riches for all of us. The question is, have they ever let anyone sleep overnight at the Guggenheim? And I don't know specifically about the Guggenheim, but it certainly is a trend in museums to have overnight stays that you can sort of be with a tour guide, but you get to really, as a group, wander and discover the riches, especially for young people, but I wouldn't say only for young people now. The Met has these great mystery tours where you have to solve a mystery by following the clues throughout many different galleries in the Met and as a group to try to solve a mystery. It's a lot of fun and it's engaging. And so there is this trend for overnights in museums, for great interactive, fascinating opportunities in museums. And I think it's a motivator for many people to enter a museum maybe that they have never thought they would be welcome in the past.